Gents, good to be back together. A week after we set out to answer this question, can an age group triathlete like Ant keep up with the pro cycling team? And what I wanted to do first of all was really set the scene on your fitness level, because you are an age group triathlete, but you are in the top percentile for age group triathletes. You've gone 8:34 for an Ironman, and Dr. Lindsey did some fitness testing on you here at the Precision Performance Lab before we went away. Lindsey, how fit was Ant going into that camp?
Really quite strong in terms of your zone 2 power, so like your first lactate threshold, you were around 230 to 250 watts. And then for your zone 3 and 4 power, so the top end of your lactate threshold, your second lactate threshold, you were kind of around 310 to 330 watts, which is really quite strong, which means your FTP was just around 330 watts as well. It's really quite strong.
Yeah, so that's good enough to win a lot of age group races and be at the sharp end.
Yeah, and to put that into context as well, you know, my top end of zone 2, you said was around 240 watts, did you say?
250.
So around 250 watts, and that's what I was doing as the 6th, 7th or 8th wheel in a warm-up to these Lotto rides. You know, I was at the top end of my zone 2, so although it was an easy ride for me, it was actually far from easy. You know, I was burning matches very early on in those rides. So yeah, it's tough just even sitting on the back of their packs when they're just cruising along, chatting away, taking off leg warmers, removing gilets and having a bit of banter amongst the group. I'm still working pretty hard, sat on the back.
What about body type? Because Ant's in great shape, you know, he weighs 73 kilos, fine figure of a man. How tall are you, Ant?
About 5'10", so 178, 7.
Yeah, so in great shape. We had his body composition measured by the team while I was out there, came out about 11% body fat. What does that tell us about the kind of shape he's in?
It's pretty good shape for anyone who's not a professional athlete. That's a really healthy target to achieve. You're not going to be at risk of any additional disease or anything like that, of course. But if we compare that to a professional rider, where during the season they're around 5 to 7% body fat, you're at 11%. And so for a rider of similar weight at 73 kilos, that might mean they'll have an extra around 4 kilos of muscle mass to allow them to produce that power and high power efforts as well. Yeah,
so, you know, it was quite amusing watching the Lotto dietitians actually try and talk quite diplomatically to a guy who's got 11% body fat, trying to tell him that they didn't think he was too big.
Can be a little bit lower, of course. You can go under 10%, but that's next step, I guess.
Thank you.
Definitely.
But they're used to dealing with people that are 6, 7, 8% body fat for a lot of the time. So it's unsurprising, I suppose. You touched on power, and we talked about Ant's power. Where do we think the gap is between Ant's average FTP sort of power, which a lot of athletes will understand for themselves, versus the watts per kilo that we're seeing these professional riders put out?
In terms of people's FTPs, Ant's was around 330. That's what he's done recently. Whereas a rider of a similar weight who's in the pro peloton at the moment, someone who could hang on to the pro peloton, they might have an FTP around 440 watts or at least an extra 100 watts. And then for someone at your weight who wants to perform really highly in the peloton, it'd be even higher than that, closer, above 450.
Yeah, and that's an FTP is what they can roughly hold for an hour, basically.
Yeah.
So this big gap exists then between the power that Ant's putting out at FTP and on these rides compared with the pro riders. But where is that difference coming from? You know, are they just genetically more gifted? Are they doing things differently in their trainings? Probably a bit of both, I guess. But that's something we could get into next. Like, where are these differences coming from? My instinct is that a big difference is going to be in the way that Ant trains versus how these professional athletes train. So, Ant, how much training do you typically do in an average week over the year? How's that split up with the sports? 'Cause I know you dug into your Training Peaks data to have a look at that.
Yeah, we had a little nose back just to reflect on that. So on average for the past 365 days, I've averaged about 12 hours of aerobic training.
Per week, is that?
Per week, yeah. And over 50% of that is spent on the bike. So it's safe to say that probably most weeks I spend 6 or 7 hours on the bike, whether that's aerobic intervals or indoor on the train or something like that. And the rest is kind of like a 50-50 split then between swimming and running. And obviously that depends on what I've got coming up as well. So, last January I was training for London Marathon, so I was spending a lot more time running. Cycling wasn't so much of a thing, and obviously as we were going towards Kona, cycling became more of a focus. So it does change a little bit.
Yeah, and I was following you on Strava over Christmas this year, definitely saw some panic cycling training.
Yeah. The moment the Lotto camp got confirmed, there was definitely a 4 to 6 week block of panic training and doing a lot of indoor trainer and trying to squeeze out some sort of wattage with high intensity efforts.
Yeah. And Lindsey, what insights did you gain from talking to the Lotto riders and stuff about their kind of training volume?
It's definitely a lot more. So for their easy week, for a Lotto rider, it might be 18 to 20 hours a week, which is almost double what you do on the bike in a normal week. And then their bigger weeks are more like 30 hours a week, maybe even up to 35 in a massive week. And across the year, that might average out at 22, 23 hours per week on the bike. And that doesn't include any additional training, like any runs that they might go for, or strength training, for example.
So bottom line, it's like 2x the training volume and 4x the time on a bike.
At least, yeah.
Yeah, which is huge.
Yeah. And we saw that on camp as well, didn't we? Day one I was there and it was just over 4 hours for ride one, which is, for me, that's a long ride. Day two was another 4 hour ride. And then day three was an optional 6 or 7 hour long ride. So, funnily enough, we didn't even consider doing that third day because that's an ultra for me.
I'm curious about intensity distribution in training, because a comment that came back from a lot of the Lotto riders and staff a lot of the time when we said, do you think Ant is going to keep up? He's an Ironman guy. They were like, well, he'll be okay on the steady stuff, but when the power goes up, blah, blah, blah.
He's going to do the test also.
Yeah.
I think a normal endurance ride he can do easily, but the test, I don't know.
Yeah.
We go all out and he's a triathlete. I don't think he's going all out every time. He's more steady pace, I think, so I think he will suffer.
What do you see as the differences there?
Definitely. It's going to be related to the type of training that they're doing. So, for example, in the 4 hour ride that the pros were doing, during one of those sessions they rose over 3 climbs, and over each of those climbs they would do a high power effort, or 3 high power efforts in each of those climbs. And so that ends up being about 9 efforts across a 4 hour ride. And for example, one of those sessions was an 8 second, or 3 repeats of it up each climb of an 8 second max effort sprint.
Yeah.
And there's an example where Ant was not able to come even anywhere close to getting to
How much wattage were you putting out on those short sprints?
So for the short sprints, I was targeting in excess of 700 watts, so bearing in mind this was like 3.5 hours deep, I'm like digging deep into the reserves here.
Yeah.
I think I peaked at about 760 watts during those 8 second efforts.
Yeah, and we heard rumour of people smashing through 1600 watts on the Lotto guys, and actually saw that when one or two of them came by you.
Yeah. And the power, it's instant power as well, whereas for me, I can start a sprint and then within 3 or 4 pedal strokes I might be hitting my max wattage, whereas for these guys, they're shifting into the big ring whilst climbing and then instantly generating. You can almost see the bike flexing underneath them. They're generating so much power on that first pedal stamp that I couldn't even get on a wheel. It was the power was that instantaneous that you couldn't even hope to be on their wheel when they actually went.
But in your defence, they're training for a sport where things are won and lost in sprints, where you need to bridge gaps, where the action happens in small bursts of time quite often. And your typical race, a marathon, an Ironman, even to an extent, a really long gravel race. I know they are a bit more punchy with power, but they're kind of even efforts. So I guess that's why your training reflects that rather than the sprinty type efforts.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So how do these riders really achieve so many more hours than you do? I guess there's one obvious answer, is their job is riding the bike. Your job is writing copy for outstanding industry newsletter about fuel and hydration. So you have to spend a lot of your day sat in front of a computer and maybe cram a training session in the evening. They ride their bike all day, and if they need to do any admin or emails, that's what they cram into their evening, I guess. And we spoke to Jan Boone, the physiologist on the camp, saying that he felt that sort of like setting up your life to take care of those basics is the biggest kind of performance hack out there.
For both amateur and professional athletes, I think the three main pillars are a good structured training program with a combination of long duration training sessions with interval training sessions, but well structured. The second thing is a good fueling strategy during your rides, also good hydration strategy during your rides. That in combination with healthy food during the day. And then the third pillar is also recovery, making sure that you have during the day the option to recover, sleep well. Sleep is one of the main recovery methods, and I think these are the three main pillars that you have to take care of to become or to perform well as an amateur and a professional cyclist, actually.
So what did you see about the way that they were living on the camp that made you think, this is where the big differences are?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few factors to that, because obviously for those 2 days, I wouldn't say I was completely living like a pro, but I was near as damn it living like a pro for those 2 days. And just being able to, wake up in the morning, know that your bike is ready to go. There's no mental stress around getting your stuff ready. Everything is just ready to go. Whereas in stark contrast to that, when I'm sat at home and I've spent the morning, writing emails, and I'm thinking, right, now I need to go for my lunchtime session, 9 times out of 10, I'm thinking, well, I'll get on the turbo for a quick hour, just because that reduces any sort of like bike maintenance and bike cleaning and all that side of stuff. And then it's more a case of, well, what can I cram into that 1 hour long session? And it'll ultimately end up being, okay, I'll do some sweet spot training or something, and I'll spend, big long chunks of time at an uncomfortable intensity. Whereas these guys have got that time and the flexibility to go out for a 4 hour long ride and have some short, sharp intervals in there. So I think the big part of that is, having their life set up around training and being able to do that. The nutrition is just done for them as well. So the minute you come in off the ride, although I didn't want to eat on day one, you could literally just walk straight into the kitchen. Food is there, done and dusted for them. So that's a huge aspect to it, just not having to spend time cooking or preparing food and getting all that kind of stuff ready.
If we look at your nutrition intake on the bike during those rides, like day one, when you rode for 4.5 hours, you averaged 123 grams of carbohydrate an hour, 633 millilitres of fluid an hour, with a relative sodium concentration of 971 milligrams per litre. So like basically pretty much in the sweet spot, similar to the numbers that they were talking about. Yeah. And on day two, you were still at 100 grams an hour of carbs. You were a little bit less fluid, 469 millilitres, which is probably a bit on the low side, but with a sodium concentration of 1200 milligrams per litre. Like, talk to us about how you found getting the nutrition in on the bike. And
yeah, day one was like a nice simple day, because there was a lot of downtime. There wasn't a lot of downtime because obviously we were still riding a lot, but there were periods where we would warm up, regroup, get new bottles, grab a gel, crack on with your 5-minute effort, same again, bit of downtime there. So I was swapping bottles out, getting more fluid on board. I was able to eat a lot more because there was a lot more chill time in between the bigger efforts. Whereas on day two, as you already highlighted, fluid was down quite substantially from day one. And this was more to me getting drops more often, to be brutally honest. I did the warm up, we did the first set of intervals up a climb, and I got dropped within 30 seconds of starting that mountain. So it was a solo slog to the top. By the time I'd got there, they were ready to turn and go as I was summiting. So I'm pretty sure you were there on camera, ready to get a quick interview, and I think very quickly then realised that I was getting dropped hard and I needed to just crack back on. So just didn't have that window to get more bottles on. And that was a bit of a repeated thing. I think on reflection, I just needed to be a bit more aware of that, because it was just a new environment. I'm just not used to it, not used to trying to grab bottles on the go. So I do remember being about 3 hours deep into that ride and having no liquid whatsoever and just still sipping back gels, because that was all I could do at that point.
You touched before about the nutrition outside the riding, because they had a great spread on every day, as you'd expect. Really fresh, healthy food at all meals, as much of it as you could possibly have wanted. But I noticed that after day one's ride, you really didn't want to eat. We had to sort of, Lindsey was in your ear
Yeah.
about eating some rice. We watched Arnaud Delis smash away like 3 massive plates of pasta. You were sort of like picking at the
Playing with
rice a
food.
little bit, playing with your food. What was that all about?
Yeah, I can't remember the exact quote now, but when I got in from that first ride, the intensity felt like I'd run a marathon, and I've never had that kind of muscle breakdown before on the bike. I've done some pretty hard sessions, I've done some pretty big riding before, but I've never broken down quite as badly as I did at the end of the first day. It's just like my whole lower back, glutes, hamstring were all just so fatigued that, you know, even taking my leg off the bike was a challenge at that point. And I only really get that kind of lack of appetite after a really hot, long race. So challenge Roth when I did that, and I went 8:34. I'm pretty sure I finished that race, and it took me a couple of hours to find an appetite. But for example, in Kona, where I'd gone so deep, it took me hours to find my appetite again. And it was a similar kind of thing after that first day, is that I kind of came in for lunch and, you know, made myself, you know, maybe a quarter of a plate of rice and a couple of bits of chicken on the side, and was just staring at the plate for a good sort of 10-15 minutes before I was then sort of picking at the rice and starting to eat it. Whereas, you know, the riders were coming in with, you know, plates of noodles and rice that were built up like pyramids. They were like huge plates, and they were just sort of scoffing them back.
And backing that up, Lindsey, with 100 plus grams to a man, they were telling us they were taking over 100 grams of carbs an hour on all those sessions.
Definitely, and some of them were even taking more. The other thing to note there is that's quite common what we see. You see a reduced appetite with increased intensity across pretty much most people. And so for these riders, yes, they did 5 minutes max effort, 12 minutes max effort on that first day, but the rest of the ride was quite easy for them. And so they'll be finishing that ride, burning through all those calories, being quite hungry towards the end of that, because the intensity is relatively low for them.
To bring in another point on the training that they were doing as well, so one of the riders that I spoke to on day 2, he talked me through what he did the day before. So he'd been out and he'd done his critical power test in the morning, come back, he'd had lunch, he'd then gone and done an S&C session.
And you didn't just do the test yesterday either, you had another session in the plan, didn't you?
I went to the gym in the afternoon, so it was maybe not the best idea, but normally it will be okay to get for the efforts.
He was squatting over 100 kilos for, you know, what I imagine was like a 65 kilo guy. You know, he's lifting big weights in the gym, and I was asking him on that second day how he thinks the impact of that day is going to affect his sprint intervals the day afterwards, and he was like, not at all, I should still be hitting the same numbers I would on any other day. So it's just phenomenal how much load they're putting through their body, and doing 2 frankly really hard sessions for us is just a normal day to them, and then they're just backing that up with another hard day and another long ride the day afterwards.
Building that consistency that is ultimately what drives the big changes in your physiology over time. The other thing, the last word on nutrition for me was, it was really interesting. The food available was very healthy. There was obviously a huge amount of carbohydrate there, but it tended to be sort of starchy rice, pasta, that kind of thing. There wasn't a lot of sweet stuff. But birthday cake came out one day because one of the members of the team, it was their birthday on the camp. It was incredible for me to see the discipline of the riders. No one said to the riders, the cake was there, you could cut it yourself. I saw riders taking like 2-inch squares of birthday cake, and these are guys who've been out on the bike all day. Like if I've been out on the bike all day and I come home and there's a birthday cake at home, like I'm going to eat a quarter of it.
Yeah.
But the discipline that you saw in them.
Didn't see any scales by the birthday cake though.
It's true, they weren't weighing the birthday cake, it was all done by eye. Let's talk about another thing, Ant, because when you're riding a bike normally and you go downhill, it's easier. It didn't look like it was easier for you when it went downhill riding with Lotto because of the level of technical skill. I saw you like absolutely busting one to even try and keep up on those descents. So, and for me, I've got to say this is where I tip my hat to you most, because if you ask me what I would be afraid of, like if someone said, oh, you got a chance to go and ride with some pro riders, it would be like descending narrow gravelly roads in the south of Spain on their training camp would put the fear of God into me.
Yeah.
How was it?
I'll be honest, when you first asked me to do the camp, that was my first big worry was that. I was like, I do not want this video to end in an RIP, and you know, he went out with a big smile on his face or anything like that. I definitely wanted to come back in one piece, and there were definitely a lot of very, very close moments out there. Just the skill of the riders is something to behold. We said it quite a few times on camps. Obviously, you guys had a really good view of that in the car, but they would be side by side in their groups of 6. They would hold that formation no matter what the road was when it came up. They would go around like hairpins without breaking formation, and I'd imagine they're still doing 50, 60, 70k an hour at points coming down these big descents. Whereas for me on the back of them, I'm taking up the whole road. I'm trying to find apexes, and I'm still getting dropped without them even putting on their race hats and thinking that they are racing. This is just a normal day in the life for them. So yeah, that was a huge point for me. Obviously, the other big point was the fact that the brakes for me were the wrong way around, which multiple times scared the living daylights out of me.
I remember on one of the descents we had that incident where you were trying to pull over to let the team car by, and there's a lot of debris on the road. It's like on a rock face, and there's a big. You hit a big boulder, exploded your front tyre, and that kind of thing. Yeah, how like nervy was that? What was the experience like? Because we managed to get this full like race experience, mechanic, wheel change, push off, and chase behind the car to get back to the group. How was that?
Yeah, I mean the immediate descent before the incident, the racing incident, should we say, was probably the glimpse of the moment where I thought, I'm in here. I'm like one of the lads, and I'm keeping up. You know, it was a long descent. There was nothing too technical about it, and I was just sort of like the 7th man in that 7-man group, because they were just strung out one by one coming down a fast narrow descent, and I felt at home the whole way down that, and it just took one corner, one slightly sharper corner where they went in a little bit too fast, and I just sort of hit the brakes a bit hard, because again a little bit worried about what was coming out the other side, because obviously most of these corners are blind, you don't know what's coming around the other side, and the gap just opened up, 1 or 2 seconds, but that's all it takes. As soon as you're out of the wind, that gap just explodes, and it was during the chase back on, if you can call it that. I was still getting dropped whilst I was trying to chase back on, but ended up pulling over to the side of the road to let the team car come through so that the team car could stick with the team. And as I was watching the car come past, as you mentioned before, there was just a bit of rubble on the side of the road that I wasn't even paying attention to, and I just hit a rock square on and demolished the front wheel, sadly. It's that type of incident that none of those riders would have gone through, because they're just able to pay attention to everything that's going on and nothing phases them.
Lindsey, it might be obvious, I don't know, but why are those guys so much better than on the bike handling side?
It's reasonably simple. I'd say for a lot of these guys, they're spending a lot more hours on the bike and training and riding in these types of locations. So Ant lives here in the New Forest, where it's quite flat. There's not very many descents and climbs, and so these guys will be spending a lot more hours riding those types of roads, as well as right next to each other in training rides and in the peloton.
And I remember peering over your shoulder and looking at your kind of training readiness metrics on your watch and phone between these days of riding. What's Garmin got to say about your body after this one, mate?
It's not positive at the moment. It's definitely saying poor, let your body recover.
They look like they were dropping off a cliff, as you might expect if you're pushing yourself that hard. But what did you see on those, and how did you feel over those 3 days? Yeah,
so I think for me personally, sort of not looking at the data, just like based on how I felt. Obviously, the end of the first ride was a particular low point. I think having worked so hard and been unable to actually take on enough food to properly recover, I felt awful all afternoon. I remember saying to you guys I was going to go up for a 1 hour nap, and I went up, couldn't really get any sleep. I was just sort of almost just too excited from the whole experience of being away riding with these guys that I was still full of adrenaline but just really tired. So I went and laid down on my bed, and my alarm went off after an hour, and I just shut it off and then went back to sleep and laid down for another hour. And then on day 2, energy levels was good. Actually was looking forward to getting back out on the bike again. Whether that was adrenaline taking over, I'm not sure, but I was genuinely looking forward to getting out on the bike. Felt a bit flat for the first sort of 10-15 minutes, and then just sort of found my legs and got into the groove and started to enjoy it again. Finishing the ride, I'm still not entirely sure why, possibly because I was eating quite a lot during that ride, but felt really good at the end of it. So energy levels were pretty good towards the end of that ride, but I think just the cumulative intensity of those 2 days, the Garmin stats were not positive, funny enough, after those 2 days worth of riding, and probably had the best night's sleep I've ever had after day 2. I was out like a light, and but could barely wake up come the Friday morning, and was a bit thankful that you said to me on Friday morning that I didn't need to go out and do a 6-hour ride. I was quite pleased with that, to be honest.
If you had decided to go out for that 6-hour ride, do you think you would have it's a very hard prediction to make. Would your legs have been okay, or do you think you were like in the bin at that point?
I think I think I genuinely would have been okay for like an hour or two. I think the fatigue would have taken over beyond that. The intensity that they would have wanted to have ridden at as well. You know, I asked the guys at the end of day 2 what they would be doing the day afterwards, and they said generally for an easy ride they'll be looking at about 3.5 watts per kilo, which for me is, you know, 240, 250 watts. So again, it's that kind of
Ironman pace.
Yes, it is Ironman pace. So, you know, upper end of zone 2, it's not an easy ride. And even sat on their wheel, you know, I know full well that, you know, I could probably be sat on their wheel on the flat doing 240, 250 watts, but they would nudge the pace up a little bit and it would become 300, 350 on the inclines, just because that's just what they do. That's how they ride. So, yeah, I honestly think I would have been all right for an hour or two, but, you know, I'd be calling an Uber or calling you guys in beyond that point.
Lindsey, you were rooming with Ant. Any quick comments on the sort of his recovery versus what you'd expect the riders to be getting on a camp like this?
Definitely. Ant mentioned that he only slept around 6 hours, which is not nothing, and it's a decent amount of sleep, but these riders would probably be sleeping at least 8 to 9 hours a night during these camps.
And finding it easier to do so because of this thing about the relative intensity. They're like not in their comfort zone, but it's the normal rhythm for them, as opposed to being like essentially doing a race every day, which is what it was like for Ant.
Yeah.
Okay, so overall, we set out to answer this question: can an age group athlete specifically and keep up with pro cyclists? I think we got the answer was basically no. You know, you did really well, and I don't say that in a condescending way. I was super impressed because you acquitted yourself brilliantly, but there was this gap. There's a gap in power to weight ratio, technical skill, ability to eat after the ride, ability to recover and sleep after the ride. You know, it was just obvious that if we'd have chucked you in there for a week, you'd have been broken. It sounds obvious. They train a lot. They do 4x the amount of bike riding you do, twice the amount of total training time, because their lives are set up for that. The primary thing they do every day is ride their bike. Everything around it is to support consistency. Dr. Jan Boom was saying to us, like, consistency of training, sleep and fueling are the 3 big things. I was very interested in the fact though that the fueling, you were able to fuel like the pros, and that's something we encourage a lot of athletes to do. Even if you don't need the as higher levels as they do all the time, it was good to see that is one thing that we can all take away as being like, okay, well, you know, if I'm training really hard for myself, I can take inspiration and learnings from these pro athletes and fuel and hydrate like them to support that performance. But what I wanted to ask you, Anne, before we wrap up, is like, loads of experiences on the camp. What's the number one that you're going to take away?
I think the number one is the very first interval on the very first day, because it was the moment where my optimism was high and I thought I'd actually be able to dig in and stick with the guys during their 5-minute power test. So I rode with the rider and figured I would be there. I'd be glued to his wheel for as long as physically possible, maybe get 2 or 3 minutes in. And honestly, he, without an attack, he rode me off his wheel within the first 45 seconds. That gap opened up and I never saw him again. He was gone. So that was definitely the most humbling and the most memorable moment for me.
Awesome. Lindsey, what about you? Because we were there as a fly on the wall and we saw most of this unfold. What did you learn as a physiologist, as a bike racing fan as well?
For sure. I think we hear a lot about zone 2 and endurance training. So obviously riding for multiple hours at these lower powers, quote unquote, around 250 watts, for a lot of people is very impressive, and it's the base of a lot of these guys riding. But what was most impressive for me was their top end power, their top end speed. So you heard about Ant getting dropped in 45 seconds there. The other thing was when they're doing their max efforts, just how fast they get to go.
I've been on this camp 3 years in a row now, and I've been fortunate in my career to work around elite athletes across a range of sports. I'm always impressed with people that are dedicating themselves to the pursuit of performance improvement. So yeah, for me that was, as it always is, a fantastic just reinvigoration of the idea of, like, if you do things properly, consistently and look after yourself, you get great results. So big thanks to Lotto, Orbea, everyone who supported the opportunity for us to go and to get his ass whooped by some professionals. It's, like, for all of us, once in a lifetime experience. So thank you very much.